Hi, everyone. Thank you, Courtney. That was amazing. Gosh, it's been such a morning of really, really good, useful, intense discussions. I think we've needed this for a long time. This section is looking now beyond the economics. And so we have a presentation that was prepared by Samantha Hargreaves of Woman, which will be delivered by Courtney. And then we'll have Vish on this section as well. So I'll hand over to Courtney to then deliver the presentation.
Thanks, Veriel. So yeah, I am presenting Samantha's paper, which is titled Crises, Dreaming and Rebuilding on African Terms. So she starts off by highlighting, and as we know, that COVID meets a number of other crises, especially in South Africa, who all kind of interlink and impact each other and connect to each other and are a result of the same system, which is extractivist patriarchal capitalism. So as she goes on, she says that these crises layer one another, each deepening and enforcing the next. And also, if you start to look at it as a whole, it becomes clear that these crises are stripping communities of their ability to reproduce themselves. And the world's poor are experiencing what is referred to as a crisis of social reproduction. As with many of the ills that we see in our society, they are felt unequally and especially felt severely in South Africa. And specifically, the working class and peasant women are bearing the brunt and the impacts of these crises. In this period where many societies are kind of now looking beyond COVID, a kind of what's next kind of phase, what they're calling the recovery. The idea by many is that, it should be just and build resilience and sustainable, and it should be inclusive and green. That's kind of the idea behind the recovery, but obviously this goal of transformation and the pathways that these groups are taking and the people that are talking about this, they are wildly divergent. So with capital and interest allied to corporations and the elite, they are honestly just seeking to advance their genocidal and ecocidal ambitions under this veil of reconstruction and development. On the other hand, we've got trade unions, peasant and social movements, and also progressive feminist organizations who are now having to keep a very vigilant and critical eye on these actors. What Samantha thinks is lacking and is desperately needed in the analysis around COVID, but also other crises, is what she calls a dreaming that recognizes and builds from living practices founded on African philosophies, spiritualities, and histories. In the adaptations, recoveries, and processes of decolonizing development that lie ahead, Africans holding a progressive, anti-capitalist, feminist, and ecological commitment are challenged to recover, recognize, celebrate, and build from long histories of practices, beliefs, and ways of being that are deeply rooted in Africa and its diverse peoples. She then goes on to outline some of the intersecting crises further. So I'm just going to go through them quickly, and more detail can be found in her paper, which we will share. So the first crisis is, of course, the crisis of climate and ecology. The year 2019 broke all previous average temperature records, and despite economic slowdown and the lockdown because of COVID-19, 2020 is actually still set to hit many of those record highs. As some of you may know, climate change has very different effects on different parts of the world, and not all of them can be predicted. So one may be unusual or an effect that we don't really speak about that often is the amount of methane frozen in the Arctic Ocean, which many call the sleeping giants of the carbon cycle. With heating and the melting of this ice, these sediments contain a significant quantity of frozen methane, which has a significantly greater warming effect than carbon dioxide. Researchers are concerned, given the volume of deposits, that a new climate feedback loop may have now been triggered that could then heighten the pace of global heating. As we know, climate change is affecting different regions of the world differently, with Africa disproportionately heating, and with little infrastructure and resources to mitigate heating and adapt to a warming world. This is, of course, as we've been saying all day, a grave injustice, given that Africa accounts for only 2 to 3% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions from energy and industrial resources. And this does include South Africa's pollution stat, which obviously we, as Patrick was saying, we are ranked quite high, but as a continent, we still only account for 2 to 3%. This claim of Africa heating at a faster rate is backed by science, of course, which is saying that warming in large areas of the continent may exceed 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times by 2080, if emissions continue at their current levels. With this climate warming, food security is, of course, deteriorating, resulting in an increase in the number of undernourished people by 45.6% since 2012. Farming land is, of course, also jeopardized, and in addition to bearing the brunt of the crisis, women also constitute a larger percentage of the world's poor. And about half of women in the world are active in agriculture. In developing countries, this is at 60%, and in low-income food deficit countries, it's at 70%. And so the projected impacts on ability to grow food on land, on agriculture, will once again impact women most severely, especially in poorer regions. The second crisis that she mentions is debt and financial flows out of Africa, which render governments incapable of meeting basic social needs, mitigating climate crisis, and supporting adaptation needs of the citizens. The state of readiness of African countries to deal with COVID-19, as well as other pandemics such as Ebola and HIV, have been gravely undermined by the hollowing out of state capacity by successive neoliberal structural adjustment policies and the accompanying privatization of our key public services such as education, healthcare, water and sanitation, of course, under the direction of international financial institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank. This then obviously also has a relevance for extraction and climate change, because the rise of extractive sectors in Africa in the past decade or so has led to the vast looting of Africa's wealth, and also severely compromises the ability of states to fulfill their developmental responsibilities. So reports show that Africa was losing more than $50 billion every year to illicit financial flows. This is, I'm sure I don't have to go into this, but this is defined as money which is earned, transferred, or utilized through illegal means and originates from corporate tax evasion, trade misinvoicing, unlawful transfer pricing, criminal activity, and the corruption of government officials. For example, the case in Nigeria is often used in this debate, where the oil and gas sector of the Nigerian economy is responsible for 92.9% of illicit financial flows. So here we see the first way in which Samantha links one crisis to another, the extraction, which contributes to both climate change as well as the debt crisis. African governments are now struggling to find the money to fight the pandemic and save lives. In contrast, rich countries are investing about 8% of their GDP on average on economic interventions and stimulus measures, while African countries are spending an average of 0.8% of their GDP. This, of course, hides quite significant differences across African countries, but overall, that is the percentage. And then speaking of pandemics, a third crisis that Samantha points out is the rise of pandemics. So COVID-19, as she says, is one in a series of infectious diseases over the past 50 years, linked to the spread of pathogens ordinarily found in animal species, most often in wildlife, to humans. So examples include HIV, avian flu, the swine flu pandemic, SARS, and the Ebola fever. The seed of most new infectious diseases lies in the rapid expansion of the extractive sector, mainly logging and industrial plantation style monocropping, such as palm oil and cocoa, and livestock production, and more recently also the mining sector, and the way in which it violently encroaches upon nature's lands and forests. For an example, the Ebola crisis, which raged through West Africa, mainly affecting Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, and killing more than 11,000 people in the period between 2013 and 2016, is directly linked to deep structural poverty in the region. These three countries were at the time respectively 183, 175, and 179 in the United Nations Human Development Index. Significant capital investments were then made in the extractive sectors, rubber tapping, cocoa, and palm oil production specifically, And this then contributed to West Africa suffering the highest deforestation rate in the world at the time. And so, whilst the little fruit bat may have been the direct source of the pathogen causing Ebola, the structural roots of the pandemic lie elsewhere in an extractivist model of development. The fourth crisis that she outlines is war, displacement, and violence against women. Climate change adds to already existing stresses in society and can therefore be characterized as a threat multiplier effect. Basically thinking of climate change as loading the dice, making conflict more likely to occur in subtle ways across a host of different country contexts. In the Sahel, this is often used as an important illustration. This is a region that is largely dependent on rain-fed agriculture, but is also then regularly impacted by droughts and floods, with significant impacts on people's food security. The combined contribution of violence, armed conflict, and military operation has displaced more than 4.9 million people and left approximately 24 million people requiring humanitarian assistance. The UN does conclude that climate change is partly to blame, which is not very common. Scientists are often not willing to link climate change to violence, but now we're seeing this link being clearly made. Of course, the land available to the more than 50 million pastoralists and their dependents is shrinking. And of course, with a shrinking space for a group of people comes competition. With competition, often can come conflict. So this is how the link is being made. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, decades of civil strife were directly linked to the control of diamond fields, involving corporations, illicit trading, elite grabs, and the corruption of traditional leaders. So war and conflict and the other crises cited here also elevate domestic and sexualized violence as families confront extreme social and economic stress. So for example, in Uganda, research undertaken by the UNDP revealed that women and girls are much more vulnerable to rape and harassment as they walk longer distances for food and water in situations of climate-related drought. And of course, the situation in South Africa is not very different, as found in the feminist participatory research undertaken by women. So in addition to all of this, people are falling ill with cancers, respiratory diseases, eye diseases, and substance addictions, which not only then contributes to the increased labor of care, which is then carried out by women in impacted communities, but ultimately also contributes to a crisis in the ability of people to have sufficient food, water, well-being, and safety, which is needed, of course, for communities to be able to survive, which is, again, i.e. the crisis of social reproduction. What Samantha says is that violence against women must be addressed alongside and cannot be separated from the related ecological and climate crisis. As she ends off the section, she just says that Africa's conflicts and wars have long been projected as domestic issues by conservative and liberal commentators from the territorial global north, who wish to characterize Africa as a hopeless mess led by corrupt leaders whose many problems are homegrown. But in reality, the continent's battles arise in part from corrupt transnational corporations and their quest for control over and to maximize profit from Africa's wealth. She then starts to conclude by giving a couple of thoughts on these various crises, their intersections, their connections, and how they link together. Once again, she mentions that all of these crises stem from the same root, which is an extractivist patriarchal capitalism. The system exploits the cheap labor of Black working class men in mines and plantations, and then rests on the unpaid labor of women as they work to house, provide water and food, care for, and generally satisfy the needs of labor and create the conditions for some measures of peace that capital needs in order to survive. The system profits from the dispossession of the peasantry and working classes of their land, of their forests, of their fisheries, and minerals, and it relies on nature as a free or cheap input to production and a sink for the external environmental costs of production. She then also highlights the links that pandemics, including the COVID-19 pandemic, has to human encroachment on forests and other wildlife habitats. She also then points out that working class and peasant women in Africa carry the burden of all of the crises listed above. And this is because of their designation as the primary household food producers, caregivers, and harvesters of water, energy, and other basic goods needed for the reproduction of life and the well-being of people. And what this does is that it not only places them in those roles, but it also places them at the front lines of the defense of nature and its right to exist, without which the survival of all beings would not be possible. She also mentions again that in the literature, what is missing is new frames of thinking about this recovery or this rebuilding, economic, political, and societal responses, and how we aren't looking enough at African philosophies, spiritualities, and practices. What she then does is to end off this this article with three main dimensions of a decolonized form of recovery, which she calls a process of dreaming African alternatives. And these three are African commoning and the protection of land and nature through customary laws and practices. The second is then the philosophy and practice of Ubuntu. And the third is then Pan-Africanism. So she calls this section Building Back with African History, Politics, and Philosophies at the Center. So these, I'm assuming, are kind of her recommendations. So the first one is customary relationships with land and nature. Land on large parts of the African continent is held under common property systems, which are traditionally characterized by the following. And she gives a list of how that plays out. I'm just going to mention a few. So first of all, those who dwell on the land are the keepers, carers, or custodians for generations to come. Land cannot be owned, cannot be sold, and that decisions about the use of the land must be made collectively by the group, tribe, or community. This is a statement of ideal and generalized rules for common property systems. There is, of course, variation from one context to the next. Importantly, these practices and beliefs of the systems have been eroded and manipulated by states and the powerful through periods of colonialism, apartheid, and now neoliberalism. It also you have to bring this up, that patriarchal, traditional, and colonial thinking has worked together and separately to undermine women's land rights and the ability to exercise rights over their land and participate in community group decision-making processes. This is something that, of course, women have long challenged. What she ends the section off by saying is that movements and organizations that have generally not worked on the terrain of land or even agrarian reform should now join up in closely watching and defending the living commons. The second kind of African alternative she speaks about is that of Ubuntu, which is a philosophy that holds, that we owe our selfhood to others and calls on us to mirror our humanity for and to each other. It sits contrary to the West's emphasis on individualism and individual human rights, asking instead that we put the interests of the community ahead of the individual in recognizing the humanity of others. We activate behavior imbued with respect, tolerance, sharing, empathy, and love. In African religious and spiritual ontology, the humanity and existence of Africans is intricately intertwined with that of plants, animals, and rivers. Ubuntu then presents us with values such as care, love, empathy, respect, and common interest over the Western individualism, which few in progressive social movements would argue do not represent the type of society, community, Africa, or even world we strive for. So in here, she also speaks about obviously the critique of Ubuntu, but it kind of ends off by saying that it does present us with values that we can use. And then finally, she speaks about Pan-Africanism, which is an ideology and political movement which has its origins in the struggles of African people against enslavement and colonization. And essentially what she says here is that, she gives some examples of various movements, but what she says in the section is that we need new dreaming about the Africa we want, which draws on African philosophy, values, politics, practices, and histories, and built from below by African citizens, and not the ideas and interests of corporations, international financial institutions, and the political elite within Africa. The solidarity of African women across the continent to stop mega projects, condemn repression and violence, and demand climate justice must be our Lone Star, building on and drawing from a long tradition of progressive Pan-Africanism. And obviously coming from women, there's a lot of experience coming out of that, with women all around the continent doing exactly that. And finally, she says that it is women in communities from below that can reflect the philosophies, cultural traditions and practices, and political histories they imagine in their futures. Yeah, that is it from me. I hope I did that justice. So yeah, Ferial, that's...
Thank you, Courtney. Yes, that was quite a bit, and it's raised. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be quite a few questions and discussions. It's some interesting points that she's made. We'll now hand over to Vish, who's going to be talking about. I just need to get my agenda out, then I can tell you. Vish is going to be talking about democratizing the economy to prevent socio-ecological collapse. Handing over to you, Vish.
Thanks, Ferial. So I'm going to build on Samantha's paper and contribution. I think what we're recognizing is that capitalist economics, bourgeois economics, whatever you want to call it, is in an epistemological crisis. It cannot think through the world that it has created. As Samantha points out, it cannot understand the deeper crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. And that's why this conversation is with progressive, heterodox economists, political economists, but also those of us who have one foot in that, but also a foot outside of that. So my contribution is from a global political ecology perspective. Now, I've also pluralized sort of collapse here as collapses, because this has got to do with systems, socio-ecological systems that are collapsing. Now, in the literature, and I've been studying civilizational crisis in my academic work, there's various perspectives on collapse. Archaeologists talk about collapse, anthropologists, and even historians. So, one view is that, there are diminishing returns from a complex society, and therefore eventually it collapses. There are other views about entropy and how chaos emerges in societies over time, and so on and so on. But one of the dominant views of collapse that climate conscious activists, etc., have been grappling with is the view from Bendel, Jim Bendel, that we are facing civilizational collapse today. And so I want to just kind of unsettle that a little bit. Is capitalist civilization collapsing? And the argument that Bendel makes is that if we overshoot, 2 degrees, then it's all collapse. Okay. Now I want to say that there's 2 problems with this. The one is that it's a Eurocentric argument about collapse, but the other argument is that it doesn't take into account the dynamics of global capitalism and ecocidal capitalism. And capitalism is based on global polarization. It is based on ecological imperialism, and it has been engendering socio-ecological systems collapses in the global south. And it has been doing this through waves of structural adjustment programs, through extractivism, and we are living through what I would call the last great dispossession of the planetary commons. The ecological substratum of capitalism, if you like, is being destroyed. So this is very, very different from saying capitalist civilization is going to collapse one big bang moment. Actually, it's already happening in the global south. We've been through 4 general crises of capitalism in the late 19th century, the interwar years, 1973. But we are now living the last general crisis, if you like, of capitalism. various things are intersecting here. And this is to echo Samantha, who did a more context-specific registering of this crisis in the context of Africa. But we have an economic crisis that we haven't recovered from circa 2007. Resource peak, according particularly oil, according to the International Energy Agency, has been hit around 2006. We've crossed the 1 degree Celsius threshold in 2015. Various reports, including the International Panel on Biodiversity, are pointing to us now shaping 75% of land surface area on planet Earth. And of course, neoliberalism, market democracy has hollowed out democracy. So we have a very serious crisis at the moment, and there are feedback loops from all of these crises tendencies. And of course, economists, mainstream capitalist economists, don't talk about crisis in these terms. But what we are also living through is socio-ecological systems collapse as these crisis tendencies register, as the feedback loops kick in, etc. And as I've been arguing, in the global south, we are seeing food systems collapse, we are seeing water systems collapse, we are seeing ecosystems collapse due to the ecocidal logic of capitalism. Now, in South Africa, and this is a good way of illustrating this point, we are one of 10 regions in the world designated a hotspot, and that's because of being south of the equator and generally bad geography, okay? And so what's expected to happen is, and we're heating at twice the global average, and as more emissions register at a planetary scale, and as we move towards 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot, in this decade, we'll probably be at 3 degrees Celsius in Southern Africa. That is catastrophic, okay, for us. Now, in the context of the worst drought in our history, we've already seen how an agricultural system that is corporatized, globalized, based on carbon has failed us. It failed us before COVID-19. It never fed about 14 million people. And it's failing us now, where you have about 30 million people in food stress while they're making mega profits, etc. But it's very clear and it's very simple. I mean, this is from the Stern Review. I mean, as temperatures increase, you are going to see the basic ecological foundations of societies collapse: food, water, ecosystems, etc. So our food system collapsed twice, actually, over the past 6 years. First, it was our maize production that collapsed, and then subsequently livestock production and mutton production, like in the Eastern Cape, etc. So the dominant food system kind of went through moments of collapse, and we haven't really been learning lessons from that. So what is driving this? And so we have these carbon capitalist lock-ins leading to collapse in ecocide. So the continued fossil fuel extraction, complex hydrocarbons, our president is talking about oil and gas offshore extraction, extending the minerals energy complex. There's regulation kicking in for all of that, policy kicking in for all of that, etc. So the more we do this, the more we deepen this lock-in towards ecocide. The second important lock-in is carbon-based energy systems and technologies in airline, in shipping, automotive, industrial agriculture, manufacturing, cement. Even the digital technologies, including this webinar, is based on carbon-based energy. So these technological systems, etc., are further, if you like, entrenching carbon capitalist lock-ins in ecocide. The third lock-in is mass consumption based on carbon-based, resource-intensive ways of living and excessive waste. And again, this lock-in, is here because of mass consumerism and so on. And if it continues being reproduced, well, it deepens the logic of ecocide. And then we have to deal with historical emissions that are bringing climate shocks and that are bringing, if you like, new deleterious conditions for our societies. So we are facing two trajectories. We are facing an eco-fascist-led extinction and the collapsing of socio-ecological systems. And this largely is the ecology of capitalism today, as I've been arguing. And there's two political expressions of this in two class projects. The one is a right-wing exclusionary nationalism, and the other is the reproduction of neoliberal globalism. China is part of the latter. And so, South Africa's recovery and reconstruction plan is in this trajectory. This is where it's taking us. Okay, it is completely bereft of any consideration of where the world is, where South Africa is as part of a climate hotspot, etc. We are the 11th highest emitter of carbon, and we owe even actually a carbon debt to the rest of the continent. But the rulers we have want to continue reproducing that system. The other trajectory, of course, is a deep, just transition based on socio-ecological transformation. And it's about an emancipatory ecology, protecting the life-enabling common systems, displacing carbon lock-ins, and engaging in socio-ecological systemic transformation. It's much more transformative, and that's what the Climate Justice Charter is all about. The systemic alternatives and the discourse we are talking about, the way we've conceptualized systemic alternatives, actually they embrace three dimensions: mitigation, adaptation, and people-led climate disaster management. That sometimes is not clear to most people. So what are some of the preconditions for democratizing the economy to achieve democratic systemic reforms to prevent collapses? Well, the first precondition is to rethink our articulation with global capitalism. We have to de-link from deep globalization. That is an absolutely necessary precondition for a macroeconomic framework. We have to re-gear, we have to recalibrate our articulation. And that means we have to challenge the sovereignty of capital, even moving beyond stakeholder capitalism and productivist catch-up socialism. So it's a de-linking based on the new ecological systems that we need to build within the limits, the ecological limits and planetary limits that we face. We also have to overcome the intellectual division of labor that is hegemonic. And with Fordist capitalism and post-Fordist capitalism, we've increasingly seen the rule of experts come to the fore. That's not to say that expertise and this form of knowledge is not important, but as we've been discussing and critiquing capitalist economics and its epistemology, it's not helping us, okay? It's taking us over the cliff. So we really have to democratize knowledge and recognize that citizens, the subaltern, also have tacit knowledge. They also have understandings of these problems, and they also have solutions. And that's what the Climate Justice Charter has been all about. Another important precondition for democratizing the economy is building the power of the organized working class. We cannot democratize the South African economy with a fragmented and divided organized working class. The working class over the past 3 decades has been weakened in the global north and in the global south. And this is a very, very important precondition for us to move forward. The precaritization, the decomposition of the working class holds us back. And then finally, we have to aggregate mass power in terms of transformative politics from below to build these new socio-ecological systems. So it's not this old Leninist conception of transition where you capture the state and then you do what you want to do from above. No, we are building the future now. We are advancing alternatives now from below. And this is happening in the context of at least 3 cycles of resistance that we've had since 1989. There's a new global imagination of the global left. And it's really about advancing these systemic transformative alternatives from below. We are now entering a 4th cycle of global resistance. And you are seeing this in the context of the moment, conjunctural moment of COVID, and the battle lines are getting drawn. They're getting drawn around versus, against austerity. They're getting drawn against continuity of fossil-based economies. They're getting drawn around defending democracy, etc. I mean, what's happening in Bolivia is very interesting, and hopefully the mass will not reproduce the fossil fuel economy. The local government shifts that are now happening in Brazil, Some of the battles, even in Chile, are interesting. I know Alfredo is critical of it. But they are what is called 1 degree Celsius movements on planet Earth. We are part of that. We are a 1 degree Celsius movement as the Climate Justice Charter movement. And as climate determinism kicks in and planetary awareness grows, these movements are also going to grow. And then I'm not going to waste much time, but just to say that some of these alternatives, systemic alternatives that are crucial for democratizing the economy, relate to the basic income grant. The basic income grant breaks the dependency of labor on capital, particularly if it's a substantive grant. And that gives a freedom to choose to reproduce life in a very different way. The life enabling commons as systems is very, very important. And from every body of thought we have, whether it's Gandhian thought, whether it's neo-Marxist thought, whether it is African traditional thought, the commons has to be stewarded democratically. And this is very, very important if we are going to turn things around. Food sovereignty is fundamentally about democratic control of food systems. Solidarity economies based on cooperatives and other democratic associate forms that can ground ecocentric production, zero waste economies, food economies, etc., are also profoundly democratic. And then, of course, planning the just transition from below in communities, villages, towns, and cities. And that's one of the tools we are busy with. This adds a different dimension to how we think about the economy, but more broadly sustaining life, etc. We've spoken a lot about democratizing the state, but I think just to underline the point that the charter is not calling for a technocratic state. It's calling for a people-driven state. Again, this is about the politics of knowledge as well. And the state we've had has basically turned its back on the tacit knowledge of the people. So with that, I'm going to stop here, but just to say that, we're not going to have a second chance. In 10 years' time, we really can't be having this conversation. So now is the moment to shift the paradigm. And this is what this workshop's all about. Thank you.